Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles individuals who are passionate about what they do for a living, about what organization they belong to, or simply passionate about the community they are a part of. Hello there, and welcome. My name is Dave Cunningham. Over the past couple of months, we've had the opportunity to watch political leaders speak to their constituents daily. Whether it be Justin Trudeau or Donald Trump, Doug Ford or Andrew Cuomo, we have been comparing and contrasting. In this episode, we're going to take a more historical perspective with a gentleman passionate about politics. Our guest is Arthur Milnes. Arthur, welcome to the program.
It's quite an honor to be here, and thank you for doing this for the community during this difficult times.
Given the fact that you've done a whole bunch of different things, all under the umbrella of communication, if I can generalize, media consultant, historian, you've also been a speechwriter, and that's the focus that I think we should be taking today. Now, what we're going to do is look back at a few political leaders on both sides of the border and talk about how they communicated their message. And we have some examples, and I think we'll start off by having you give us some general abilities a leader needs to have when he takes over the reins of power.
Well, the first thing a successful leader requires is the support of his or her troops, the caucus, the cabinet, the senior levels of the public service, the ability to bring your partisan troops into battle and lead them, not always follow them, but lead them. Mm-hmm. Then there's the incredible amount of personal skills that a successful leader requires, particularly during a crisis. One needs to be empathetic. One needs to be firm. One needs to be confident. Yet at the same time, in this case, you have to exude confidence. At the same time, you have to keep on message that these are difficult times. Mm-hmm. And above all else, in good times or bad, a leader cannot hesitate when in a crisis mode.
Right.
If a prime minister hesitates when a crisis hits, the first people who are negatively impacted by that are the prime minister's staff. Then that filters out to the cabinet, to the caucus, to the senior levels of the public service. And in the fascinating thing and the most important skill the leader has to have is you're making these decisions in a crisis situation, and you're doing it without all of the information, and you know that. And 50% of the time you can be wrong. But whatever the situation, you simply cannot hesitate. That's where a political leader gets into difficulties.
You have to make a decision.
Yes.
Let's bring that around to speech writing and speech delivering, if you will. Does it make a difference who the audience is when the leader is making a speech?
Completely. Good, very good question. And often there's multiple audiences. So again, at a time of political crisis, the prime minister's speech might be in private. It might be to caucus. And he or she, as the leader, has to reassure the troops that there is a better tomorrow. And he or she's got to get them leaving that caucus room, ready to fight another day, ready to take the prime minister and government's message home to their ridings. Other times, because I know we're going to talk about Franklin Roosevelt here in Kingston in 1938, again, multiple audiences. President Roosevelt was sending a very clear message to the Axis capitals in Germany and in Italy. He was also speaking directly in defiance of his own nation's public opinion, who a large chunk wanted no war whatsoever. He was also sending a message to Canadians that America would defend our country. So that can be quite complicated. Oh, and I almost forgot, and some leaders do forget this sometimes, the audience standing in front of them. In this case, it was Queen's University students and staff. You can't forget them either.
No.
So it's an amazing juggling act. And the process, I worked for Mr. Harper when he was Prime Minister. The process is fascinating because I came from a journalism background. And in many ways, what would happen would be the director of speechwriting would call us together. We're a very small group, 3 or 4. And the director would divvy out assignments, just like an editor at the Whig Standard would, right?
Right.
And you would look ahead, say a month, for example, maybe even longer. And you would be given your assignments. I was often assigned to work on addresses with Mr. Harper in the history area. And you then go off like a reporter. You're a reporter within the federal government. And because you work for the Prime Minister, everybody has to return your calls. However, that doesn't mean they want to give you the information. Often you need a lot of background information from within the civil service, etc. And everybody in Ottawa wants a piece of the Prime Minister's public words. They're the most valuable piece of real estate in Ottawa and in the country as well. So it's quite a fascinating process. And then by the time, and then it would go through a review process. But the best part of the review, often the most brutal part of the review, was the speechwriters would practice the speech on each other in a group meeting. And
that would be
boy, could you get your drafts torn apart, right? Yeah, a lot of good humor, but also some pretty brutal. If you have an ego about your writing, don't go work for the Prime Minister of Canada as a speechwriter, right? Because it's definitely not about you. So then it would go outside the department for department head checkoffs. It then would go to the Privy Council bureaucratic experts for a fact check, not a style check, but a fact check. And then it would go to the Prime Minister. And with Mr. Harper, you have to remember that he himself had been a speechwriter. and to make then he would take the drafts that he was presented and often entirely rewrite them. And I always tell my friends that by the time Mr. Harper got to the podium, 85-90% of the address was his. You know, he's a very capable speechwriter.
Was that common with most political leaders, that they had a hand in writing their own speeches, or did a lot of them rely on speech writers?
Well, remember how relatively new the speechwriter is. The first U.S. president to work with a president, to work with a writer, was President Harding. And then in Canada, here in Kingston, actually, one of the first ever speechwriters was Leonard Brockington, was one of the first. Okay. And he worked with Mr. King during the war, Prime Minister King.
Okay.
So I would say a bad leader simply reads a script. The famous story is Nelson Rockefeller, the billionaire, when he's vice president, giving a speech. He obviously was bored, and he gets to one point in his notes or in the speech that his staff has presented to them and says, "Laugh line here." He just read it out. And so a very accomplished speaker, you know, of course, they make the speech their own.
And that's probably a key skill that we haven't talked about, and that's the ability to deliver the speech. In particular, if you are relying on someone else's words, you have to make them your own and being able to communicate. And that's a skill that a lot of leaders have and some don't have.
Yeah, and there's definite tricks that you'll see a skilled speechwriter use, often right off the top. And if you're going to deliver a message to an audience that really is not on your side, then often humor is an excellent way to begin your address.
Mm-hmm.
So the famous one a lot of people have used, it comes from Lyndon Johnson, which is the speaker gets introduced. In this case, it was President Johnson, and he gets a very fulsome and laudatory introduction because he's the president, of course. And Johnson then goes up to the microphone and he says, "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. And you know, folks, and Mr. Chairman, my father would have liked that introduction. But my mother, she would have believed it." And from that moment forward, whatever your message is, the audience likes you. Mm-hmm. And in that way, it's just a nice entree. It shows the audience you're human and you're humorous.
Okay, Arthur, we have a few examples of speeches and the impact that those speeches had, and I think we're going to start with 1916.
I'm going to talk about one of my heroes, which is Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And Laurier, he came to power in 1896, and he left office in 1911. But he stayed on. And then the horrors of the First World War hit, obviously, in 1914. And at a time of wartime, and we're seeing it today with the COVID crisis, it's a very difficult time for opposition leaders. You have to be supportive of the national effort. At the same time, finding your areas to criticize are difficult. But let's remember that Laurier gives one of my favorite addresses of his in 1916. So we're 2 years in, and Europe for Canadians and the British and the French and the Germans is a bloodbath. And it's hard to find a Canadian family who hasn't sadly learned the brutality and cost of war that the young men overseas are experiencing. And Laurier is speaking to a group of young people in London, Ontario. And this is where he says his famous statement about love is better than hate, and faith is better than doubt. And it's just a beautiful speech. But the interesting part that's not talked about very much is here we are in this hyper war setting. And we talk about the Germans as the Hun, and German soldiers are killing thousands of Canadians overseas. So Laurier brilliantly brings his audience along with him, with his critique and his anger at the German high command and the German military leaders. But he carefully, once he's brought the audience along, he reminds them that the war and conflict Canada is engaged in is not being waged on the German people. It's about the German military. And it's just a beautiful way of, how do I put it? Just a powerful way of Laurier to reminding us what matters, in the sense that the German people are people too. Mm-hmm. And it's a very brave thing to do in 1916. And I've always, when I look back on Laurier, I did a book about him. I've always admired that address of mm-hmm. his. That's a very difficult address to make.
That was 1916. We're going to scoot ahead to something we've already briefly talked about, and that's August 18th, 1938, here on the Queen's campus. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was at a convocation ceremony receiving an honorary Doctor of Laws degree, and I think it was the same weekend that he was dedicating the Thousand Islands Bridge, was it not?
Yes, same day.
And so he delivered a speech. And before we talk about it, we're going to play a very short clip from that speech recorded that particular day. So let's give a listen to that first.
The Dominion of Canada is part of the sisterhood of the British Empire. I give to you assurance that the people of the United States will not stand idly by if domination of Canadian soil is threatened by any other empire.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, speaking on the Queen's campus when he received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. Tell us about the significance of that speech and that comment in particular.
First off, let's remember who's delivering the address. I always, when I write about Franklin Roosevelt, I call him the patrician president. And he was an extremely wealthy man. He had a life and life experiences that you would think would make him totally unable to relate to the working man and woman. And instead, here was this president at the height of the Great Depression who exuded confidence. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Reassures not just Americans, but Canadians, because we too listen in on our radios while the man from Hyde Park, New York, delivers his famous fireside chats at the height of the Great Depression. So 1938, he comes to Kingston, which is an incredible feat that the university here pulled off, and they should forever be complimented for that. So in 1938, August 1938, it's pretty clear that the war clouds are gathering over Europe. So Roosevelt comes here, and he has a couple of audiences, like I said earlier. One of the messages he's sending right at Berlin and Rome. And for Canadians, it's this, when Roosevelt says America will back and defend Canada if we are ever attacked, what an incredible statement. It seems, it doesn't seem that revolutionary thing, but at that time it sure was. And that really, this is the Canadian American security policy is still guided by that speech here in Kingston all these years later. So for that address, and it's very short.
It's 15 minutes long, the whole thing. Yeah,
exactly. And I recommend any Kingstonian go online, or any Canadian anywhere, and listen to Franklin Roosevelt's speech here. Just a remarkable address, and his delivery is spot on. And he accomplishes, I think it's one of the great leadership speeches, outside of Lincoln at Gettysburg, et cetera, that have ever been delivered. And it happened right here in Kingston.
I don't want to run out of time before we get to a couple of others if we can. 1965 is the year. Lyndon Johnson is president in the U.S., and he's talking to Congress about the Voting Rights Act. So can you give us a little background on how that speech came about?
Yeah. And there's just been, when Johnson goes to Congress and stands at that podium, there have just been those horrific events seen on every American and Canadian and worldwide television screens of the horrific events in Selma, Alabama. And Johnson goes to Congress. And let's remember, Johnson's from the hill country in Texas. He's a Southerner. He knows racism. He's practiced it in other points of his life. So there he stands in front of his former colleagues. And you have to remember that much of the pushback against civil rights came from the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats, senators and congressmen. Yet here was one of their own. And he gives this incredible address. And he says, the civil rights issue and what happened in Selma, Alabama, is not a Black or African American problem. It's not a Southern problem. It's not a Northern problem. It's an American problem. And he therefore doesn't just single out the South. This is a national problem that his people have to overcome. And he sets up his audience, and then he famously assumes the mantle of the civil rights movement by using the famous phrase, we shall overcome. And at that moment, it becomes next to impossible for the Congress not to support voting rights. It's a remarkable address.
The last one we have time for, I think, is Brian Mulroney speaking to his caucus, and I think the year was 1992.
Yeah, I was quite privileged to serve as Mr. Mulroney's memoir colleague, researcher. So I got to read his notes, his private notes of caucus speeches that the Prime Minister Mulroney delivered over 9 years as the Prime Minister of Canada. And they're remarkable in the sense that, you know, the Conservative Party would be at 8 or 9% in the polls during the dark times. And they would have those caucus meetings, and Prime Minister Mulroney would fire up those troops, and they would lead, despite the bad public opinion polls, they would leave that room once a week ready to fight another day. It was a remarkable use of political rhetoric. So one of my favorites occurs in the early 90s when the issue of placing certain gay rights protections in the Canadian Human Rights Act. Very minor by today's standards, but at the time it was a very controversial move. And so how Mr. Mulroney handles it is he gets in there to caucus and he fires up the troops and he says, and I'm paraphrasing some of the language, he says, is there any other party in this country that has representation from every single province and territory? And they shout, you know, they all shout back, no, it's just us. Is there any other party in the House of Commons that has more ethnic representation than us? And everybody cheers, right? And then he hits them with it. And he says, so statistics say that 10% of the population is gay. So logic tells me that 10% of the people in this room are gay. And how could we vote against our brother and sister Conservative MPs who are gay? And through rhetoric, those troops, even if they're questioning gay rights and that, they have to leave that room on side. It's a brilliant speech.
And that's what gets me too, is the ability to do that in a mass setting, if you will, where there are a whole bunch of people. So instead of having to go to each one and try and talk them into supporting a particular approach, he does it with rhetoric in the context of a caucus meeting. That's great.
Yes, and it again, the other audiences prime ministers have to speak to again in private are the cabinet. Mm-hmm. And that can be very difficult.
Now, I told you before we started recording this program that we would run out of time. And we have run out of time on the show. And there's all sorts of other people we could talk about, but I really do appreciate you taking the time to share some of your memories about some of the people that you've dealt with or some of the research that you've done. And for news junkies like us, it's good to have some of the historical components built into the discussion. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Anytime, Dave, and as you've just learned, ask my wife. You get Arthur Milnes talking about political history speeches, could go on for hours, so thanks for cutting me off.
Okay. Thank you, Arthur.
Hey, good stuff.
Theme music for the program is Stasis Oasis, a tune written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of our episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast Facebook page. This is Dave Cunningham from Kingston, Ontario. Thank you for listening. Until next time.